So as a writer, I feel like my main emotional reason for writing is to make a connection with the reader. So for me, when I'm writing, I'm definitely writing in a solitary space, right? But even as I'm writing, I'm conscious somewhere in the back of the mind that hopefully somebody will be reading it. So it's not a diary, in other words. It's not meant really to be a private piece of writing. So I'm trying to make a connection with the reader, and then the question becomes, who is the reader? And for me, because I am an outsider in this country, and I've been here 45 years, so it's strange to still think of yourself as an outsider, but I think that is that remains a big core. So one thing, am I writing for the Vietnamese? Am I writing for American-born who have not been to Vietnam, or maybe have some ideas about Vietnam that I think are based on a misunderstanding of Vietnam, right? So in many ways, I feel like my first book, which is that I am a bridge. I'm writing to create a bridge between different communities. Mm-hmm. Then the next question becomes, what kind of a bridge is it? Mm-hmm. So do I want to make the bridge very easy for people to cross? Or do I want the bridge for the reader? Do I want to impose a very difficult impediment for the reader to cross it? And this is actually a debate among writers. Mm-hmm. I mean, it sounds like it's a very simple question, but it's not, because the question becomes, how much do you explain? Right? When you write, if your point is to make a connection to the wider community, do you make it easy for them, or do you make it hard for them so that they have to do the work themselves? So I think different writers are going to make different decisions regarding this quest. Some writers will say, I don't care if you understand it at all. It's up to you to do the work to understand us. Some writers like me feel like I want to make it a little bit easier, because the misunderstanding is so deep that maybe it's easier for me to correct that misunderstanding. I'm going to make it easy by maybe explaining. And in many ways, I think that that is a very female, my way is a very female way of writing, because I know that that's a loaded word, female, male, because I feel like women tend to explain more because women want to be understood. Whereas men, the male position is usually that, because the male position is the norm, the male position is not the outsider position, right? So only outsiders need to explain. So taking a female position women have always been about making connections and being relational. So to me, being relational involves explaining. Too much explaining is not going to be good. So there's always a balance, right? So in some ways it is a struggle within myself, because sometimes I think to myself, I don't want to reinforce the femaleness. Maybe women should explain less. Maybe immigrants should explain less. Maybe refugees should explain less. Maybe outsiders should explain less. And so it is a calibration for me, but I do not take the position that don't explain anything, because let the mainstream work to understand us. I think that's also a legitimate position. I just don't think that it is something that comes naturally for me. So I think different objectives, different desires are going to be, what I mean is different authors are going to have different objectives and different desires. So my purpose in writing is to make a bridge. And then the question becomes, what kind of a bridge? How much do I make it easy for the crossing? And how much do I just go, I don't give a fuck whether you understand or not, right? And that's not my attitude. Regardless of whether I encounter it personally, which I have, that notion that that is happening, I take with me everywhere, whether or not it actually is happening. Because it's like the water you swim in, right? So you're asking, does the fish know that it is swimming in water? Does the fish know that there is something slightly off about the water? And it would know if it's taking a gulp, it drinks the water. But that water is there, whether or not you are aware of it, or whether or not the fish is actually drinking it. And the water, the environment is such that I think there is going to be a degree of otherness. You can call that colonialism or exoticism, right? So I know, for example, when I was working in a law firm, this was in Wall Street, as a litigator in the litigation department, you know, it's a very male world, and it's a very dominantly it's aggressive in the sense that you've got to stand up for yourself in that world, and that's very different than the world of yin, which is sort of like the Asian female is very yin, right? Like the stereotype is kind of like quiet, passive, inert. So you have to go against that stereotype. And I think when you are with another lawyer and they expect that exotic behavior, kind of like compliant and pliant, you know, like a Madame Butterfly kind of behavior, and to be appealing to men. Right? That is what is expected of women. When you don't act that way, you're viewed as being very unpleasant to work with. So in that way, right, those are just small examples of how when you go against the stereotype of being exotic meaning your difference is appealing, right? So when somebody says you're exotic, they're focusing on the fact that you're different, and the difference fits in with their preconception. Because there are degrees of differences. There are some differences that somebody will find to be very unacceptable. And exotic difference is something that is very acceptable to the mainstream because they like it. So when you don't go with that, you are viewed as, you're not very pleasant. So again, you know, when I am writing, I know that in the back of my head. And as I said, whether it happens to me or not is actually irrelevant because I know it's there. I just have not encountered it all the time. So I think to answer your question, I would say, yeah, it affects how I write and how I portray a certain character. Do I want that character to fit into that stereotype, or do I want the character to go against that stereotype? You know, I like something that the writer Bharati Mukherjee said. You know, she wrote Middleman and Jasmine. She said something, I may get the exact quote wrong, but something like, exoticize the familiar and familiarize the exotic. So she says, like, if there is an immigrant custom that is very exotic and you're writing about that, maybe write it in a way that makes it totally non-exotic, like it's just as common as gravity. And if it is something that is very mainstream, any practice that is considered mainstream, like Thanksgiving, as an immigrant writer, maybe make it be very exotic. Like how strange that this is the thing that they do. And I think that's a very interesting way of approaching it too. I rather find something common to all of us that are universal to all of us than to say that, you know, here's how we are different. I prefer the universal. Not to suppress the particular, right? But to find common bonds. So on a personal level, I think that if one is curious, so I want to raise a child who is curious. And I think curiosity opens up the world for you in a way that thinking that you already know everything will not open up the world, right? So I think it's a degree of humility, knowing that there are a lot of things you don't know, and being curious about what you don't know will make you be worldly, because you're going to know that it's important to know that you don't know. And that way you're going to be more open to other ideas. So, you know, I like to take my kid traveling. Because when you travel, you really see there's so much I don't know. And it's natural. In other words, it's not something that you consciously like brainwash your kid. Right? It's not like you're sitting them down and say, this is the lesson plan for today. I think when you take the child traveling, you're going to make them curious without telling them, I want you to be curious. I think that can turn into a way of life for them more than if you are advising them. Because in fact, when I try to give advice to my child, she says, I don't want to hear your advice. Maybe being an immigrant is somewhat similar to a form of dissociation, because you're hyphenated. You know what I mean? Like you're not fully American and you're not fully Vietnamese. So there are different parts of you. And so to take it to its logical conclusion, like you take one point about being fragmented, being divided, and then I just explore it as far down as possible and just, you know, make a character that if you were fully fragmented and divided, what would it look like?
I see.
We started out showing each other our chapters. So I would write something, show it to her, and I would want her to show it to me. And we discovered that that did not work well for us, because we would disagree with what the other person writes about us in their chapter. And I think that because I raised my child, you know, to be very free and curious and to speak her mind, she was very free in how she spoke to me. Like she didn't like this, she didn't like that. And in some ways we're more like friends sometimes than parent and child. So because that didn't work, you know, it led to too many conflicts. We changed our process so that we would just write our own chapters and we wouldn't show it to the other person, or we would just show it to our editor. And then the editor would be the one that would be talking to us, right? Because the editor would, of course, read all of our chapters, and then she would address her comments to each one of us or together. And so I think having the editor you have to have a very good editor to be able to do this. Like the editor has to be a good bridge. So we had a very good editor, 2 editors, and they were both able to do that. So they were like the mediator, they're like the ambassador. It's like my daughter's one country, I'm another country, and then we have 2 ambassadors to negotiate with us, and that's how the book came about. And it turned out that that process worked well, because when it wasn't planned, it flowed more than if it had been planned. So that was a big discovery for me, that sometimes you can plan too much. Like if we had read each other's chapter, it would have been a very deliberate strategy on how to write. But because we couldn't do that, what came out turned out to be more natural than if we had planned it. Because I feel like I don't feel like I know anything, how to even conduct my own life, much less advise anybody. So I kind of stumble along in my own life, so I'm in no position to advise. But if I were to redo things, I would speak to my kid in Vietnamese more. I didn't. I think that was a mistake. I think the brain is capable of being comfortable with many languages. And there's no fear that if you have more than one language, that neither language will be good. I think you can be very good at many languages. And I think being good with many languages is good. It doesn't take away, it adds. So I would have done that differently. And I think Vietnamese in my life, as I said, is like water. It's just there. Whether or not I want it to be there, I have different relationships with it at different times. Sometimes I resent it because it would be nice just to erase all of it and not think about it and just live in the moment. And the moment is the US and English.